Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. There are 7 versions of the capture of Matthew Killer Kimes. All of them include him jumping over the edge of the Grand Canyon. Preceding that craziness, we'll see 2 stolen cars, 2 kidnappings, hundreds of rounds fired, and numerous posses activated. June 1927's Decades of Heistery starts off in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and we begin with the Montgomery Advertiser and its June 7, 1927 title, Daring Bandit is Surrounded by Armed Posse. They're misspelling. The sizable subtitle was, Orders are shoot to kill if gang leader wanted for dozen crimes is seen. Big rewards offered. So here's where this tale begins. On the morning of June 6, 1927, Matthew Kimes was spotted in Pawhuska, Oklahoma's business district. The witness immediately notified police, who immediately rushed to the scene. Kimes reacted quickly and bolted out of town, trailed by police who waited until they were about a mile or so out of town before they opened up fire with their arsenal. Kimes eventually abandoned ship, which later revealed that it had been struck 4 times. Now on foot, he bolted across a field and fortuitously came across Red Carter, a rancher from whom he commandeered a car, and Carter as the driver. Kimes kept Carter really close to him physically, forcing the pursuing officers to withhold from firing more gunshots. But at some point during the next leg of the chase, Kimes, quote, ejected Carter from the car, end quote. But since police had closed the distance between them, he hoofed it into the woods, taking refuge about 4 miles or so southeast of Pawhuska. Well, 100 plus, quote, heavily armed posse men, end quote, surrounded the woods with those shoot-to-kill rules of engagement, since there were those large rewards offered for him, dead or alive. Well, at some point, police considered that the spotting and chase of Kimes could have actually been a ruse intended to draw police from town so Kimes' crew could hit another bank or 2. But it turns out that there were no robberies that day in Pawhuska. The New Britain Daily Herald ran a catchy title, admits he's rival of Jesse James. They also update us on the posse's success with the subtitle, Kimes Again Eludes Posse, plans 3 jobs this month. The story refers to him as a, quote, young bandit chieftain, end quote, and noted his ambition to show up Jesse James. Well, it seemed that Bloodhounds had been brought in as well, but by that point the posse essentially admitted that they'd abandoned hope of capturing Kimes. But how did the writer from the New Britain Daily Herald know that Kimes had planned 3 more heists for the month of June? Well, supposedly Kimes, or a member of the gang, sent a letter to the local paper in Pawhuska that warned, quote, officers to expect 3 more jobs in 30 days, end quote. The article provides us an update on Mrs. Campbell, who was shot in the head while holding a child during the recent Beggs, Oklahoma double bank heist led by Kimes. She'd been upgraded to injured since. This version also identified gang members of having operated in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri for several months, and had an unusual success in, quote, escaping in thickly wooded places, end quote. However, Danny Daniels and Howard Lanson were captured at Nowata, Oklahoma, June 6. Daniels and Lanson engaged in a gunfight during which Daniels was struck and wounded. Another possible gang member, Roy Wilson, was referenced in the Calico Rock Progress, which is the first time we referenced that paper. He was under arrest and held at Okmulgee, Oklahoma, charged with complicity in the May 18, 1927 bank heists at Beggs, Oklahoma. Being a former resident from the area, in this case Yellville, Arkansas, the paper stated, quote, "There is considerable doubt in his home county as to his guilt," end quote. Well, another week, another kidnapping or two, and another eluding a posse for Matthew Kimes. The Brownsville Herald brought us Kimes, Bank Bandit, Kidnaps Officer, and it was subtitled "Officers and Posses Join in Most Extensive Manhunt in History of State." Now this is where it starts to get crazier. One Orville F. Noble and his wife went to visit a friend in Drumright, Oklahoma one evening. They parked their car and went inside, not realizing that there was a car thief in the area who needed some wheels. Matthew Kimes stole their car, but he didn't realize that the Nobles had left their 2-year-old child asleep in the back seat. Thankfully, the heavily sleeping child was found, quote, "soon afterward on a vacant lot 2 blocks from where the car was stolen, still sound asleep," end quote. However, what appeared to be a child kidnapping, not necessarily a Matt Kimes related issue to police, ended up rousing all the police in northeast Oklahoma. And the story gets weirder from here. Marshal George McAnich of Jennings, Oklahoma, got word that the stolen car was headed towards Jennings. So he and a man whose first or last name was Morris got into cars and went to block the road into town. And then they awaited Kimes' arrival. Kimes arrived and came to a stop at that blockage. Officer McAnich walked up to the vehicle. Morris watched and thought that McAnich had arrested Kimes since the marshal got into the car with Kimes. Job done, in Morris's mind. Morris headed back to town. Minutes later, Morris and others who'd gathered to discuss the excitement saw the Nobles' stolen car speeding through Jennings, and they saw Marshal McAnich inside the vehicle who appeared to be a prisoner. Kimes sped out of town and eventually stopped somewhere halfway between Manford and Turton, where he ordered the marshal out of the car. Kimes then tied McAnich to a tree, fastening his feet with the marshal's gun belt and his arms with the marshal's pants. Then he set the officer's revolver on the ground and took off once again. Well, McAnich was able to work himself free somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m., at which point he went to the home of a farmer, called the operator in Jennings to tell his wife and friends that he was safe. Well, despite Kimes being spotted in Cleveland, Oklahoma, which is in Pawnee County, and then chased onto Hominy, Oklahoma, which is in Osage County, the trail went cold for the Pawnee County posse that had formed. The Bismarck Tribune ran, "Oklahoma has warrants out for a youngster," and subtitled the story, "21-year-old youth is most wanted man in state, price on his head." Kimes was referred to as a, quote, "slick-haired youth of 21," end quote, and they noted that the reward had been raised to $50,000. Apparently, officers declared Kimes as, quote, "not the usual type of Western desperado," end quote, and that he was, quote, "short and stocky and affects the metropolitan dress of a modern drugstore cowboy." That meant he wore the garb of a cowboy, but wasn't actually a cowboy. The Brownsville Herald provided "spectacular chase ends as Oklahoma bad man gives up." But we aren't in Oklahoma anymore. Instead, we head to Flagstaff, Arizona, where the, quote, "flight of Matthew Kimes," end quote, was stopped after another gun battle, and he was captured under the rim of the Grand Canyon. At the time, he was being held in a Coconino County jail with a Mr. and Mrs. G.H. Cady. Now, again, here's where the story gets weirder still, but there are going to be up to 7 different versions of his capture. Most of them agree that Kimes and the Cadys entered the Grand Canyon National Park together on June 23rd. The Cadys claimed that they picked Kimes up on the streets of Dodge City, Kansas. While the park foreman and the park ranger apparently noticed Kimes hiding in the back seat as the trio entered the park and allegedly recognized him. So they called Chief Forest Ranger J.P. Brooks to alert him. The trio arrived at Bright Angel, which is a trail and had some cabins and a hotel or two as well. The Cadies went inside and registered under their names, but Kimes went in and registered as Harry Watkins of Oklahoma. Now, the rest of the information comes from 11 different papers and provides the 7 different versions of his capture. After registering, Kimes left the Cadies and he headed to Yavapai Point, where he was met by Sheriff J.O. Parsons of Coconino County. Parsons was there on some sort of business, but had been notified by Oklahoma authorities that Kimes could be headed his way. Parsons asked Kimes to accompany him to the National Park Service office located near the rim of the canyon. So you know what happens next. Kimes accompanies him. However, once the sheriff passed the building, Kimes escaped by jumping over the edge of the Grand Canyon. He disappeared under thick cover of scrub oak and pine on a slope that dropped 200 feet to that Yavapai Point, which from there dropped an additional 1,500 feet. Another posse was formed, attempting to encircle Kimes. Shots were fired between the two, and shortly thereafter, Kimes gave up and said, quote, "I quit, fellows. I know when I'm stuck," end quote. Now here's a version of what happened after his capture. When Kimes was taken in, he readily admitted who he was. He had 6 $50 bills on him and noted that he'd lost $1,100 gambling just before he started out for the Grand Canyon from Bristow, Oklahoma. Officers asked about bank robberies that had been attributed to them, and he noted that he'd heard about them but had no involvement. Kimes did admit to having served a sentence for bank robbery, but that he'd been released. Here's a version of the connection between Mr. and Mrs. Cady and Matt Kimes. When Mr. Cady was questioned as to his connection, he said that he'd known Kimes while working on Oklahoma oil fields, and he was aware that Kimes was an escapee. The New Britain Daily Herald offered a quartet of titles and used, for the first time in print in my recollection, the nickname Killer. Title: Noted Desperado Finally Captured. Matthew Killer Kimes Caught at Grand Canyon. Hesitates to shoot. Draws gun, but evidently fears sheriff would beat him to the trigger. Hops over the rim of the Grand Canyon in escape attempt. Here is version number 2 of his capture. Allegedly, Sheriff Parsons accosted him as opposed to in version 1 where he asked him to accompany him. Kimes reached for one of the 2 auto pistols that he was known to carry, but realized he couldn't beat the sheriff, so he jumped over the rim of the Grand Canyon. Here's what happened post-capture version 2. Kimes readily admitted to who he was when he was presented a photo and description of himself, and he said, quote, "That's me all right," end quote. Now, the Mr. and Mrs. Cady Matt Kimes connection version 2 was that Cady, his wife, and Matt Kimes were all handcuffed together, and at this point, supposedly, Cady claimed that the first time he met Kimes was near Dodge City, Kansas, when they met him on the street and offered him a lift. The Coconino Sun ran a story the same day and provided lots of local flair and intelligence, or at the very least, a fanciful rendition of the capture. So a little bit of background here. Apparently, Bert Lauzon was the custodian of the Bright Angel Trail, and he was also a constable at Grand Canyon. Well, he'd received word from the sheriff's office at Okmulgee, Oklahoma, quote, several days ago, end quote. He was informed that 5 men were traveling in a Buick, a Packard, and a Studebaker, and they were set to arrive at the Grand Canyon around the 20th or so to, quote, get the payroll, end quote. So Lauzon wired for more details and received pictures, names, and the description of the men, including Kimes, 2 men named Garrett, a man named Whitehead, and one other unnamed man. When Lauzon got Kimes' description, he was advised that Kimes might be dressed up as a swell and that he even might be made up as a woman. That is not the first time I've heard that. Lauzon informed park officials and he kept an eye out. This is why when Kimes and the Cadys arrived in their Buick sedan, Leo Smith at the registration office was able to recognize Kimes, and he notified Lausanne, bringing us to capture version number 3. Allegedly, Sheriff Parsons went to one of the Bright Angel cottages and found Kimes, at which point he asked Kimes to accompany him to the administration building. For some reason, Parsons got into the Katie's car with Kimes at the wheel. Well, as they descended the hill from El Tovar Hotel, Kimes said, quote, "The brakes won't hold," and so they overshot the administration building. He was able to stop the vehicle by using the emergency brake. As he rose up from applying the emergency brake, he revealed a Colt .45 in his right hand. Parsons grabbed Kimes' hand and the gun and set off a 15-minute fist fight. They punched and grabbed and ended up on the floor of the car. At some point, Curly Ennis, who was a garage foreman, saw the fight. He initially thought it was a couple of drunks. He then went over and peered into the car and faced the muzzle of that .45, aiming right in his face. One of the combatants supposedly said, quote, "Get away." Now, George Cravey, trail foreman, came along and faced the same Colt aimed in his direction. Now, neither Ennis nor Cravey was able or interested to enter the fray, so Curly Ennis booked it over to the garage for his gun. As he retreated, he heard 3 shots, followed by 5 more. Shots 1 through 3 were fired from inside the car by Kimes, but Parsons was able to force the muzzle away, so they actually hit the back seat. Then Kimes finally was able to get out of the car and took off. Parsons exited too and fired off shots 4 and 5. Kimes turned around and fired back shots 6, 7, and 8. The Coconino Sun made it a point to note that Parsons was a good shot, but that his hands were bleeding from the fight and that he was near exhaustion. At that point, then Kimes allegedly jumped over the rim of the Grand Canyon. Then the posse was formed. This time it's 30-plus men, heavily armed, and they began to track Kimes down that now 300-foot initial drop. Kimes was then surrounded and said, quote, "I give up. I know when I've had enough," end quote. Now for some Coconino Sun hometown cooking. Cravey's rifle was at some point trained on Kimes, so Ennis went up and took away Kimes' gun, which was fully loaded, quote, "but he knew he had no chance against the 2 men facing him," end quote. Post-capture version included Parsons, Lausanne, and Ennis taking Kimes and the Katies to Williams, Arizona by train that night. From there, Kimes and the Katies were driven in automobiles, arriving Coconino at about 1:50 a.m. Quote, "Kimes from that time until the cell door clanged behind him here this morning was a very peaceable hombre," end quote. Kimes stated that he lived in Bristow, Oklahoma, that he was a tool dresser for a job, and that he had a wife in Oklahoma. When asked where he was heading, he figured he'd come see the Grand Canyon, and then he thought he might head on up to Seattle. In his belongings, Kimes had grease paint, lipsticks, and theatrical makeup items. Now for the third version of the connection between Katie and Kimes. Katie, whose name had been spelled K-A-D-Y the entire time, may have actually been Katie, K-E-A-D-Y. Allegedly, he was coming to Flagstaff for the Prescott Frontier Days 4th celebration, where he had competed in the past. Katie admitted he had known Kimes for some time. This is a third entirely different version of the connection between the two. Mrs. Katie was allegedly sick, and she said that her husband brought her out to Arizona for health improvement. And officers at that point didn't think that Katie was involved. The Milwaukee Leader ran a story that same day. Dent's Career of Oklahoma, Jesse James, provides us capture version number 4. Apparently, Sheriff Parsons eyed a pair of men curiously in a Grand Canyon hotel. Who comprised this pair? Well, it turned out that the Whitehead that we mentioned in the alert to Lausanne was J.C. Whitehead, and the pair was Kimes and him. Kimes realized that Parsons had recognized them and tried to shoot his way out. Somehow, Kimes attempted to, at some point during the shootout, kidnap Parsons but failed. Instead, he got into a car and fled, but was shortly thereafter captured after Parsons fired at him, and the citizenry in the area heard a general alarm. Arizona's own June 24 Douglas Daily Dispatch ran a fifth version of the capture. Kimes indeed left the Cadies in their hotel and headed directly to Yavapai Point. When accosted by Parsons, he pulled a revolver, and Parsons started toward him, so Kimes slipped over the rim of the Grand Canyon. Post-capture version number 5, Parsons, Emmett Ennis, which I assume is Emmett Curly Ennis, and Deputy Virgil Logan, which I assume they mean Lozon, accompanied the handcuffed trio on that train ride from Bright Angel to Williams, Arizona. The Douglas Daily Dispatch from June 25th ran something of a Chamber of Commerce ad, noting that Kimes, quote, could not resist the awe-inspiring wonder of the world, the Grand Canyon, end quote. Oh, and it had another version of the capture. From his cell, Kimes allegedly told newspaper reporters that he'd had a premonition of his capture. Quote, I'd gone back to my room at the cabin and was lying down when somebody knocked. It was the sheriff, and I knew I had to do some quick thinking, end quote. That was when he and Parsons got into the car and headed to the administration building. Kimes noted, quote, Parsons is about 60 years old, and with my superior strength, I figured I had every chance in the world to escape, end quote. Post-capture version number 6 had Kimes reminiscing about some recent crimes, and he noted he was, quote, happier when in a game, end quote. That means gambling, than when, quote, punching a safe, end quote. When told some pals of his were in the vicinity, he said he'd be glad to see them, but he didn't think he'd remember them since he'd last had contact with them while at the McAllister prison. The Montgomery Advertiser ran a June 26th article about Kimes' return to Coconino County Jail. They noted Kimes was kept under heavy guard and armed men patrolled all the roads leading into Coconino County, fearing that members of his gang might, quote, attempt a jail delivery, end quote, and escape, not unlike the one from Sallisaw, Oklahoma, that he'd already participated in. Post-caption version number 7. Kimes thought that the Grand Canyon would be a good place to keep undercover. At the same time, he allegedly said he was, quote, on his way to the Pacific coast when captured, end quote. The Imperial Valley Press ran a cool title on June 27th, Airplane Used to Keep Bandit with Officers. It seemed that Oklahoma authorities took Kimes by car to the New Mexico-Oklahoma border under heavy guard, aiming for Okmulgee, Oklahoma. They provided hourly updates by telegram as they progressed through New Mexico. But fearing an external escape attempt, they decided that an airplane would be used for part of the remainder of the journey. Oh yeah, that G.H. Cady, he was identified as Ray Doolin, a distant relative of Matthew Kimes, and thought to possibly be a member of the Kimes gang. Well, indeed, Kimes jumped over the edge of the Grand Canyon. But for Matthew Kimes, the real fall was that his days of freedom were through. We'll follow up if more becomes available on Matthew Killer Kimes. Next week, another follow-up video including updates on a Kimes associate, Wilbur Underhill, and the fake priest, Mike Evans, and much more. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.